Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everybody. Last we left off, we were going to get into chapter 14, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Apparently right after I yawn. Good golly. I get the worst yawns. Anyway, let's begin. Let's jump right into it. At 9 o'clock the next morning, his servant came in with a cup of chocolate on a tray and opened the shutters. Dorian was sleeping quite peacefully, lying on his right side with one hand underneath his cheek. He looked like a boy who had been tired out with play or study. The man had to touch him twice on the shoulder before he woke, and as he opened his eyes a faint smile passed across his lips, as though he had been lost in some delightful dream. And yet he hadn't dreamed at all. His night had been untroubled by any images of pleasure or of pain. But youth smiles without any reason. It's one of its chiefest charms. He turned round and, leaning upon his elbow, began to sip his chocolate. The mellow November sun came streaming into the room. The sky was bright, and there was a genial warmth in the air. It was almost like a morning in May. Gradually, the events of the preceding night crept with silent, blood-stained feet into his brain, and reconstructed themselves there with terrible distinctnness. He winced at the memory of all that he had suffered, and for a moment the same curious feeling of loathing for Basil Hallward that had made him kill him as he sat in the chair came back to him, and he grew cold with passion. The dead man was still sitting there, too, and in the sunlight now. How terrible that was. Such hideous things were for the darkness, not for the day. He felt that if he brooded on what he'd gone through, he'd sicken or grow mad. There were sins whose fascination was more in the memory than in of the doing them. Strange triumphs that gratified the pride more than the passions, and gave to the intellect a quickened sense of joy, greater than any joy they brought or could ever bring to the senses. But this was not one of them. It was a thing to be driven out of the mind, to be drugged with poppies, to be strangled, lest it might strangle one itself. When the half-hour struck, he passed his hand across his forehead, and then got up hastily and dressed himself with even more than his usual care, giving a great deal of attention to the choice of his necktie and scarf-pin, and changing his rings more than once. He spent a long time over breakfast, tasting the various dishes, talking to his valet about some new liveries that he was thinking of getting made for the servants at Selby, and going through his correspondence. At some of the letters he smiled. 3 of them bored him. One he read several times over, and then tore up with a slight look of annoyance in his face. That awful thing, a woman's memory, as Lord Henry had once said. After he'd drunk his cup of black coffee, he wiped his lips slowly with a napkin, motioned to his servant to wait, and going over to the table, sat down and wrote 2 letters. One he put in his pocket, and the other he handed to the valet. "Take this round to 152 Hertford Street, Francis, and if Mr. Campbell is out of town, get his address." As soon as he was alone, he lit a cigarette and began sketching upon a piece of paper, drawing first flowers and bits of architecture, and then human faces. Suddenly he remarked that every face he drew seemed to have a fantastic likeness to Basil Hallward. He frowned, and, getting up, went over to the bookcase and took out a volume at hazard. He was determined that he wouldn't think about what had happened until it became absolutely necessary that he should do so. When he'd stretched himself on the sofa, he looked at the title page of the book. It was Gautier's Emeraude et Gamès, Carpentier's Japanese paper edition, with a Jacquemart etching. The binding was of citron green leather, with a design of gilt trellis work and dotted pomegranates. It had been given to him by Adrian Singleton, and as he turned over the pages his eye fell on the poem about the hand of La Seigneur, the cold yellow hand du supplice encore mal lavé, with its downy red hairs and its doigts de faune. He glanced at his own white paper fingers, shuddering slightly in spite of himself, and passed on, until he came to those lovely stanzas upon Venice. Sur une gamme chromatique, le sein de Paris ruisselante, la Vénus de l'Adriatique, sortilio son corps rose et blanc, les dômes sur l'azur des ondes, souvent l'affreuse pour contour, se fent comme des gorges rondes, que soulève un soupir de mort. Le skuf à bord et me dépose, et j'attends son amarre à plier, devant une façade rosée, sur le marbre d'un escalier. How exquisite they were. Highly keep me, I can't believe I got through that French. As one read them, one seemed to be floating down the green waterways of the pink and pearl city, seated in a black gondola with silver prow and trailing curtains. The mere lines looked to him like those straight lines of turquoise blue that follow one as one pushes out to the Lido. The sudden flashes of color reminded him of the gleam of that opal and iris-throated birds that flutter round the tall honeycombed campanile, or stalk with such stately grace through the dim, dust-stained arcades. Leaning back with half-closed eyes, he kept saying over and over to himself, devant une façade rosée, sur le marbre d'un escalier. The whole of Venice was in those two lines. He remembered the autumn that had passed there, and a wonderful love that had stirred him to mad, delightful follies. There was romance in every place, but Venice, like Oxford, had kept the background for romance, and to the true romantic, background was everything, or almost everything. Basil had been with him part of the time and had gone wild over Tintoret. Poor Basil, what a terrible way for a man to die. He sighed and took up the volume again and tried to forget. He read of the swallows that fly in and out of the little cafe at Smyrna, where the Hadjis sit counting their amber beads, and turbaned merchants smoke their long, tasseled pipes, and talk gravely to each other. He read of the obelisk in the Place de la Concorde that weeps tears of granite in its lonely, sunless exile, and longs to be back by the hot, lotus-covered Nile, where there are sphinxes and rose-red ibises and white vultures with gilded claws, and crocodiles with small barrel eyes that crawl over the green steaming mud. He began to brood over these verses, which, drawing music from the kiss-stained marble, tell of that curious statue that Gautier compares to a contralto voice, the monstre charmant, that couches in the porphyry room of the Louvre. But after a time the book fell from his hand. He grew nervous, and a terrible fit of horror came over him. What if Alan Campbell should be out of England? Days would elapse before he could come back. Perhaps he might refuse to come. What could he do then? Every moment was of vital importance. They had been great friends once, 5 years before, almost inseparable, indeed. Then the intimacy had come suddenly to an end. When they met in society now, it was only Dorian Gray who smiled. Alan Campbell never did. He was an extremely clever young man, though he had no real appreciation of the visible arts, and whatever little sense of beauty of poetry he possessed he had gained entirely from Dorian. His dominant intellectual passion was for science. At Cambridge he had spent a great deal of time working in the laboratory, and had taken a good class in the natural science tripos of the year. Indeed, he was still devoted to the study of chemistry, and had a laboratory of his own, in which he used to shut himself up all day long, greatly to the annoyance of his mother, who had set her heart on his standing for Parliament, and had a vague idea that a chemist was a person who made up prescriptions. He was an excellent musician, however, as well, and played both the violin and the piano better than most amateurs. In fact, it was music that had first brought him and Dorian Gray together. Music and that indefinable attraction that Dorian seemed to be able to exercise whenever he wished, and indeed exercised often without being conscious of it. They had met in Lady Berkshire's, the night that Rubinstein had played there, and after that used to be seen together always at the opera and whatever good music was going on. For 18 months their intimacy lasted. Campbell was always either at Selby Royal or in Grosvenor Square. To him, as to many others, Dorian Gray was the type of everything that is wonderful and fascinating in life. Whether or not a quarrel had taken place between them, no one ever knew. But suddenly people remarked that they scarcely spoke when they met, and that Campbell seemed to always go away early from any party at which Dorian was present. He had changed, too, which was strangely melancholy at times. He appeared almost to dislike hearing music and would never himself play, giving as his excuse, when he was called upon, that he was so absorbed in science he had no time left in which to practice. And this was certainly true. Every day he seemed to become more interested in biology, and his name appeared once or twice in some of the scientific reviews in connection with certain curious experiments. This was the man Dorian was waiting for. Every second he kept glancing at the clock, and as the minutes went by he became horribly agitated. At last he got up and began to pace up and down the room, looking like a beautiful caged thing. He took long, stealthy strides, and his hands were curiously cold. The suspense became unbearable. Time seemed to him to be crawling with feet of lead, while he by monstrous winds was being swept towards the jagged edge of some black cleft of precipice. He knew what was waiting for him there. He saw it, indeed, and shuddering, crushed with dank hands, his burning lids, as though he would have robbed the very brain of sight and driven the eyeballs back into their cave. It was useless. The brain had its own food on which it battered, and the imagination, made grotesque by terror, twisted and distorted as a living thing by pain, danced like some foul puppet on a stand and grinned through moving masks. Then suddenly time stopped for him. Yes, that blind, slow-breathing thing crawled no more, and terrible thoughts, time being dead, raced nimbly on in front, and dragged a hideous future from its grave and showed it to him. He stared at it, and its very horror made him stone. At last the door opened, and his servant entered. He turned his glazed eyes upon him. "Mr. Campbell, sir." A sigh of relief broke from his parched lips, and the color came back to his cheeks. "Ask him to come in at once, Francis." He felt that he was himself again. His mood of cowardice had passed away. The man bowed and retired, and in a few moments Alan Campbell walked in, looking very stern and rather pale, his pallor being intensified by his coal-black hair and dark eyebrows. "Alan, this is kind of you. I thank you for coming."
"I had intended never to enter your house again, Gray, but you said it was a matter of life and death."
His voice was hard and cold, and he spoke with slow deliberation. There was a look of contempt in the steady, searching gaze that he turned on Dorian. He kept his hands in the pockets of his astrakhan coat, and seemed not to have noticed the gesture with which he had been greeted. "Yes, it's a matter of life and death, Alan, and to more than one person. Sit down." Campbell took a chair by the table, and Dorian sat opposite to him. The two men's eyes met, and in Dorian's there was infinite pity. He knew what he was going to do was dreadful. After a strained moment of silence, he leaned across and said, very quietly, but watching the effect of each word upon the face of him that he'd sent for, "Alan, in a locked room at the top of this house, a room to which nobody but myself has access, a dead man is seated at a table. He's been dead 10 hours now. Don't stir. Don't look at me like that. Who the man is, why he died, how he died, are matters that do not concern you. What you have to do is this."
"Stop, Gray. I don't want to know anything further. Whether what you've told me is true or not true doesn't concern me. I entirely decline to be mixed up in your life. Keep your terrible secrets to yourself. They don't interest me any more."
"Alan, they'll have to interest you. This one will have to interest you. I'm awfully sorry for you, Alan, but I can't help myself. You're the one man who's able to save me. I'm forced to bring you into the matter. I have no option. Alan, you're scientific. You know about chemistry and things of that kind. You've made experiments. What you've got to do is destroy the thing that's upstairs. To destroy it, that not a vestige of it will be left. Nobody saw this person come into the house. Indeed, at the present moment he's supposed to be in Paris. He'll not be missed for months, and when he is missed there must be no trace of him found here. You, Alan, you must change him, and everything that belongs to him in a handful of ashes, that I may scatter in the air."
"You're mad, Dorian.
I was waiting for you to call me Dorian.
You're mad, I tell you. Mad to imagine that I would raise a finger to help you. Mad to make this monstrous confession. I will have nothing to do with this matter, whatever it is. Do you think I'm going to peril my reputation for you? What is it to me? What devil's work you're up to?
It was suicide, Alan.
I'm glad of that, but who drove it to him? You, I should fancy.
Do you still refuse to do this for me?
Of course I refuse. I will have absolutely nothing to do with it. I don't care what shame comes on you. I should not be sorry to see you disgraced publicly. Disgraced.
How dare you ask me, of all men in the world, to mix myself up in this horror? I should have thought you knew more about people's characters. Your friend Lord Henry Wotton can't have taught you much about psychology, whatever else he's taught you. Nothing will induce me to stir a step to help you. You've come to the wrong man. Go home to your friends. Go to some of your friends. Don't come to me. Alan, it was murder. I killed him. You don't know what he had that made me suffer. Whatever my life is, he had more to do with the making or the marring of it than poor Henry has had. He may not have intended it. The result was same.
Murder. Good God, Dorian, is that what you've come to? I shall not inform upon you. It's not my business. Besides, without my stirring in the matter, you're certain to be arrested. Nobody ever commits a crime without doing something stupid. But I will have nothing to do with it.
You must have something to do with it. Wait a moment. Listen to me. Only listen, Alan. All I ask of you is to perform a certain scientific experiment. You go to hospitals and dead houses, and the horrors that you do there don't affect you. If in some hideous dissecting room of fetid laboratory you found this man lying on a leaden table with red gutters scooped out in it for the blood to flow through, you simply would look upon him as an admirable subject. You wouldn't turn a hair. You wouldn't believe that you were doing anything wrong. On the contrary, you'd probably feel that you're benefiting the human race, or increasing the sum of knowledge in the world, or gratifying intellectual curiosity, or something of that kind. What I want you to do is merely what you've often done before. Indeed, to destroy a body must be far less horrible than anything else what you're accustomed to working with. And remember, it's the only piece of evidence against me. If it's discovered, I'm lost, and it's sure to be discovered unless you help me.
I have no desire to help you. You forget that. I'm simply indifferent to the whole thing. It has nothing to do with me.
Alan, I entreat you, think of the position I'm in. Just before you came, I almost fainted with terror. You may know terror yourself some day. No, don't think of that. Look at the matter purely from the scientific point of view. You don't inquire where the dead things on which your experiment come from. Don't inquire now. I've told you too much as it is, but I beg of you to do this. We were friends once, Alan.
Don't speak about those days, Dorian. They're dead.
The dead linger sometimes. The man upstairs, for example. He's not going away. He's sitting at the table with his bowed head and outstretched arms. Alan, if you don't come to my assistance, I'm ruined. They'll hang me, Alan. Don't you understand? They'll hang me for what I've done.
There's no good in prolonging this scene. I absolutely refuse to do anything in the matter. It's insane of you to ask me.
You refuse?
Yes.
I entreat you, Alan.
It's useless.
The same look of pity came into Dorian Gray's eyes. Then he stretched out his hand, took a piece of paper, and wrote something on it. He read it over twice, folded it carefully, and pushed it across the table. Having done this, he got up and went over to the window. Campbell looked at him in surprise, and then took up the paper and opened it. As he read it, his face became ghastly pale, and he fell back in his chair. A horrible sense of sickness came over him, and he felt as if his heart was beating itself to death in some empty hollow. After 2 or 3 minutes of terrible silence, Dorian turned round and came and stood behind him, putting his hand upon his shoulder. I'm so sorry for you, Alan, but you leave me no alternative. I have a letter written already. Here it is. You see the address. If you don't help me, I must send it. If you don't help me, I will send it. You know what the result will be. But you're going to help me. It's impossible for you to refuse now. I tried to spare you. You'll do me the justice to admit that. You were stern, harsh, offensive. You treated me as no man has ever dared to treat me, no living man at any rate. I bore it all. Now it is for me to dictate terms. Campbell buried his face in his hands, and a shudder passed through him. Yes, it's my turn to dictate terms, Alan. You know what they are. The thing's quite simple. Come, don't work yourself into this fever. The thing has to be done. Face it and do it. A groan broke from Campbell's lips, and he shivered all over. The ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece seemed to him to be dividing time into separate atoms of agony, each of which was too terrible to be borne. He felt as if an iron ring was being slowly tightened around his forehead, as if the disgrace with which he was threatened had already come upon him. The hand upon his shoulder weighed like a hand of lead. It was intolerable, and it seemed to crush him. Come, Alan, you must decide at once. I cannot do it, he said, mechanically, as though words could alter things. You must. You have no choice. Don't delay. He hesitated a moment. Is there a fire in the room upstairs? Yes, it's a gas fire with asbestos. I shall have to go home and get some things from the laboratory. No, Alan, you mustn't leave the house. Write out on a sheet of notepaper what you want, and my servant will take a cab and bring the things back to you. Campbell scrawled a few lines, blotted them, and addressed an envelope to his assistant. Dorian took the note up and read it carefully, and then he rang the bell and gave it to his valet with orders to return as soon as possible and to bring the things with him. As the hall door shut, Campbell started nervously, and having got up from the chair, went over to the chimney place. He was shivering with a kind of ague. For nearly 20 minutes neither of the men spoke. A fly buzzed noisily about the room, and the ticking of the clock was like the beat of a hammer. As the chime struck 1, Campbell turned around, and looking at Dorian Gray, saw that his eyes were filled with tears. There was something in the purity and refinement of that sad face that seemed to enrage him. "You're infamous, utterly infamous," he muttered. "Hush, Alan, you've saved my life." "Your life? Good heavens, what a life that is! You've gone from corruption to corruption, and now you've culminated it in crime. In doing what I'm going to do, what you forced me to do, it is not of your life that I'm thinking." Alan, I wish you had 1,000th part of the pity for me that I had for you." He turned away as he spoke and stood looking out at the garden. Campbell made no answer. After about 10 minutes, a knock came to the door, and the servant entered, carrying a large mahogany chest of chemicals, with a long coil of steel and platinum wire, and 2 rather curiously shaped iron clamps. "Shall I leave the things here, sir?" "Yes, and I'm afraid, Francis, that I have another errand for you. What's the name of the man at Richmond who supplies Selby with orchids?" "Harden, sir." "Yes, Harden. You must go down to Richmond at once and see Harden personally. Tell him to send twice as many orchids as I ordered, and to have as few white ones as possible. In fact, I don't want any white ones. It's a lovely day, Francis, and Richmond is a very pretty place. Otherwise, I wouldn't bother you about it." "No trouble, sir. What time should I be back?" Dorian looked at Campbell. "How long will your experiment take, Alan?" he said in a calm, indifferent voice. The presence of a third person in the room seemed to give him extraordinary courage. "It'll take about 5 hours. "It'll be enough time, then, if you are back at 7:30, Francis. Or stay, just leave my things out for dressing. You can have the evening to yourself. I'm not dining at home, so I shall not want to." "Thank you, sir." "Now, Alan, there's not a moment to be lost. How heavy this chest is, I'll take it for you. You bring the other things." He spoke rapidly and in an authoritative manner. Campbell felt dominated by him, and they left the room together. When they reached the top landing, Dorian took out the key and turned it in the lock. Then he stopped, and a troubled look came into his eyes, and shuddered. "I don't think I can go in, Alan." "It's nothing to me. I don't require you." Dorian half opened the door, and as he did so, he saw the face of his portrait leering in the sunlight. On the floor in front of the torn curtain, it was lying. He remembered that the night before he'd forgotten, for the first time in his life, to hide the fatal canvas, and was about to rush forward when he drew back with a shudder. What was that loathsome red dew that gleamed wet and glistening on one of the hands, as though the canvas had sweated blood. How terrible it was! More horrible, it seemed to him for the moment, than the silent thing he knew was stretched across the table, the thing whose grotesque, misshapen shadow on the spotted carpet showed him that it had not stirred, but was still there as he had left it. He heaved a deep breath, opened the door a little wider, and with half-closed eyes and averted head, walked quickly in, determined that he wouldn't look even once upon the dead man. Then stooping down and taking up the gold and purple hanging, he flung it right over the picture. There he stopped, feeling afraid to turn around, and his eyes fixed themselves on the intricacies of the pattern before him. He heard Campbell bringing in the heavy chest and the irons and the other things that he had required for dreadful work. He began to wonder if he and Basil Hallward had ever met, and if so, what they thought of each other. "Leave me now," said a stern voice behind him. He turned and hurried out, just conscious that the dead man had been thrust back into the chair and that Campbell was gazing into a glistening yellow face. As he was going downstairs, he heard the key being turned in the lock. It was long after 7 when Campbell came back into the library. He was pale, but absolutely calm. "I've done what you asked me to do. Now goodbye, let us never see each other again." "You've saved me from ruin, Alan. I cannot forget that." As soon as Campbell had left, he went upstairs. There was a horrible smell of nitric acid in the room, but the thing that had been sitting at the table was gone. Chapter 15. That evening at 8:30, exquisitely dressed and wearing a large buttonhole of Parma violets, Dorian Gray was ushered into Lady Narborough's drawing-room by bowing servants. His forehead was throbbing with maddened nerves, and he felt wildly excited, but his manner as he bent over his hostess's hand was easy and graceful as ever. Perhaps one never seems so much at one's ease as when one has to play a part. Certainly no one looking at Dorian Gray that night could have believed that he had passed through a tragedy as horrible as any tragedy of our age. Those finely shaped fingers could never have clutched a knife for sin, nor those smiling lips have cried out on God and goodness. He himself could not help wondering at the calm of his demeanor, and for a moment felt keenly the terrible pleasure of a double life. It was a small party, got up rather in a hurry by Lady Narborough, who was a very clever woman with what Lord Henry used to describe as the remains of really remarkable ugliness. She had proved an excellent wife to one of our most tedious ambassadors, and having buried her husband properly in a marble mausoleum, which she had herself designed, married off her daughters to some rich, rather elderly men, she devoted herself now to the pleasures of French fiction, French cookery, and French spirit when she could get it. Dorian was one of her especial favourites, and she always told him that she was extremely glad she had not met him in early life. "I know, my dear, I should have fallen madly in love with you," she used to say, "and thrown my bonnet right over the mills for your sake. It's most fortunate that you were not thought of at the time. As it was, our bonnets were so unbecoming and the mills were so occupied in trying to raise the wind that I never even had a flirtation with anybody. However, that was all Narborough's fault. He was dreadfully short-sighted, and there's no pleasure in taking a husband who never sees anything." Her guests this evening were rather tedious. The fact was, as she explained to Dorian, behind a very shabby fan, one of her married daughters had come up quite suddenly to stay with her, and to make matters worse, had actually brought her husband with her. "I think it's most unkind of her, my dear. Of course I go and stay with them every summer after I come from Hamburg, but then an old woman like me must have fresh air sometimes. And besides, I really wake them up. You don't know what an existence they lead down there. It's pure, unadulterated country life. They get up early because they have so much to do, and go to bed early because they have so little to think about. There's not been a scandal in the neighbourhood since the time of Queen Elizabeth, and consequently they all fall asleep after dinner. You shan't sit next to either of them. You shall sit by me and amuse me." Dorian murmured a graceful compliment and looked round the room. Yes, it was certainly a tedious party. Two of the people he'd never seen before, and the others consisted of Ernest Harridan, one of the middle-aged mediocrities so common in London clubs who have no enemies, but are thoroughly disliked by their friends. Lady Ruxton, an overdressed woman of 47 with a hooked nose, was always trying to get herself compromised, but was so peculiarly plain that to her great disappointment no one would ever believe anything against her. Miss Erline, a pushing nobody with a delightful lisp and a Venetian red hair. Lady Alice Chapman, his hostess's daughter, a dowdy, dull girl, with one of those characteristic British faces that once seen are never remembered, and her husband, a red-cheeked, white-whiskered creature, who, like so many of his class, was under the impression that inordinate joviality can atone for an entire lack of ideas. He was rather sorry he had come, till Lady Narborough, looking at the great ormolu gilt clock that had sprawled in gaudy curves on the mauve-draped mantel-shelf, exclaimed, "How horrid of Henry Wotton to be so late! I sent round to him this morning on chance, and he promised faithfully not to disappoint me." It was some consolation that Harry was to be there, and when the door opened and he heard his slow, musical voice lending charm to some insincere apology, he ceased to feel bored. But at dinner he couldn't eat anything. Plate after plate went away untasted. Lady Narborough kept scolding him for what she called an insult to poor Adolphe, who invented the menu specially for you. And now and then Lord Henry looked across at him, wondering at his silence and abstracted manner. From time to time the butler filled his glass with champagne, and he drank eagerly, and his thirst seemed to increase. "Dorian," said Lord Henry at last, as the schadenfreude was being handed round, "what is the matter with you tonight? You're so out of sorts." "I believe he's in love, and that he's afraid to tell me for fear I should be jealous. He's quite right, I certainly should." "Dear Lady Narborough, I have not been in love for a whole week, not in fact since Madame de Furbeau left town." "How you men can fall in love with that woman, I really cannot understand it." It's simply because she remembers you when you were a little girl, Lady Narborough. She's the one link between us and your short frocks." She doesn't remember my short frocks at all, Lord Henry, but I remember her very well at Vienna 30 years ago, and how décolletée she was then." "She's still décolletée," he answered, taking an olive in his long fingers, "and when she's in a very smart gown she looks like an edition deluxe of a bad French novel. She really is wonderful and full of surprises, and her capacity for family affection is extraordinary. When her third husband died, her hair turned quite gold from grief." "How can you, Harry? It's a most romantic explanation. But her third husband—" "Wait, it's a most romantic explanation, but her third husband, Lord Henry. You don't mean to say Ferrol's the fourth?" "Certainly, Lady Narborough." "I don't believe a word of it." "Well, ask Mr. Gray. He's one of her most intimate friends." "Is it true, Mr. Gray?" "She assures me so, Lady Narborough. I asked her whether, like Marguerite de Navarre, she had their hearts embalmed and hung at her girdle. She told me she didn't, because none of them had any hearts at all." Four husbands, upon my word, that is trop de zèle." "Trop d'audace, I tell her." "Oh, she's audacious enough for anything, my dear. What's Ferrol like? I don't know him." The husbands of very beautiful women belong to the criminal classes." Lady Narborough hit him with her fan. "Lord Henry, I'm not at all surprised that the world says that you're extremely wicked." "But what world says that? It can only be the next world. This world and I are on excellent terms." Everybody I know says you're very wicked." "It's perfectly monstrous, the way people go about nowadays, saying things against one behind one's back that are absolutely and entirely true." Isn't he incorrigible?" "I hope so. But really, if you all worship Madame de Ferrol in this ridiculous way, I shall have to marry again, so as to be in the fashion." You will never marry again, Lady Narborough. You were far too happy. When a woman marries again, it's because she detested her first husband. When a man marries again, it's because he adored his first wife. Women try their luck, and men risk theirs.
Narborough wasn't perfect.
If he had been, you wouldn't have loved him, my dear lady. Women love us for our defects. If we have enough of them, they'll forgive us anything, even our intellects. You'll never ask me to dinner again after saying this, I'm afraid, Lady Narborough, but it's quite true.
Of course it's true, Lord Henry. If we women didn't love you for your defects, where would you all be? Not a one of you would ever be married. You'd be a set of unfortunate bachelors. Not, however, that would alter you much. Nowadays all the married men live like bachelors, and all the bachelors like married men.
Fin de siècle.
Fin de globe.
I wish it were fin de globe. Life is a great disappointment.
Oh, my dear, don't tell me that you've exhausted life, when a man says that one knows that life has exhausted him. Well, Lord Henry's very wicked, and I sometimes wish that I had been, but you're made to be good. You look so good. I must find you a nice wife. Lord Henry, don't you think that Mr. Grey should get married?
I'm always telling him so, Miss Narborough.
Well, we shall look out for a suitable match for him. I shall go through Debrett carefully tonight and draw out a list of all the eligible young ladies.
With their ages, Lady Narborough?
Of course, with their ages slightly edited. Nothing must be done in a hurry. I want it to be what the Morning Post calls a suitable alliance, and I want you both to be happy.
What nonsense. People talk about happy marriages. A man can be happy with any woman as long as he doesn't love her.
What a cynic you are, cried the old lady, pushing back her chair and nodding to Lady Ruxton. You must come and dine with me soon again. You're really an admirable tonic, much better than what Sir Andrew prescribes for me. You must tell me what people you'd like to meet, though. I want it to be a delightful gathering.
I like men who have a future, and women who have a past. Or would you think that would make it a petticoat party?
I fear so. 1,000 parties, my dear Lady Ruxton. I didn't see you hadn't finished your cigarette. Never mind, Lady Narborough. I smoke a great deal too much. I'm going to limit myself for the future.
Pray don't, Lady Ruxton. Moderation's such a fatal thing. Enough of it is as bad as a meal. More than enough is as good as a feast.
Lady Ruxton glanced at him curiously. You must come and explain that to me some afternoon, Lord Henry. It sounds a fascinating theory, she mumbled as she swept out of the room. Now mind you don't stay too long over your politics and scandal, cried Lady Narborough from the door. If you do, we're sure to squabble upstairs. The men laughed. Sorry, I knocked something over. It startled me. The men laughed, and Mr. Chapman got up solemnly from the foot of the table and came up to the top. Dorian Gray changed his seat and went and sat by Lord Henry. Mr. Chapman began to talk in a loud voice about the situation in the House of Commons. He guffawed at his adversaries. The word doctrinaire, word full of terror to the British mind, reappeared from time to time during his explosions. An alliterative prefix served as an ornament of oratory. He hoisted the Union Jack on the pinnacles of thought. The inherited stupidity of the race, sound England common sense, he jovially termed it, was shown to be the proper bulwark for society. A smile curved Lord Henry's lips, and he turned round and looked at Dorian.
Are you better, my dear fellow? You seemed rather out of sorts at dinner.
I'm quite well, Harry. I'm tired, that's all.
You were charming last night. The little Duchess is quite devoted to you. She tells me she's going down to Selby.
She's promised to come on the 20th.
Is Monmouth to be there too?
Oh, yes, Harry.
He bores me dreadfully, almost as much as he bores her. She's very clever, too clever for a woman. She lacks the indefinable charm of weakness. It's the feet of clay that make the gold of the image precious. Her feet are very pretty, but they're not feet of clay. White porcelain feet, if you like. They've burned through the fire, and what fire does not destroy, it hardens. She has had experiences, you see. How long has she been married?
An eternity, she tells me. I believe, according to the peerage, it's 10 years, but 10 years with Monmouth must have been like an eternity, with time thrown in. Who else is coming?
Oh, the Willoughbys, Lord Rugby and his wife, our hostess Geoffrey Close, and the usual set. I've asked Lord Grotrian.
I like him. A great many people don't, but I find him charming. He atones for being occasionally somewhat overdressed by being always absolutely overeducated. He's a very modern type.
I don't know if he'll be able to come, Harry. He may have to go to Monte Carlo with his father.
Oh, what a nuisance people's people are. Try and make him come. By the way, Dorian, you ran off very early last night. You left before 11. What did you do afterwards? Did you go straight home?
Dorian glanced at him hurriedly and frowned. No, Harry, I didn't get home until nearly 3.
Did you go to the club?
Yes. And then he bit his lip. No, I don't mean that. I didn't go to the club. I walked about. I forget what I did. How inquisitive you are, Harry. You always want to know what one has been doing. I always want to forget what I've been doing. I came in at 2:30, if you wish to know the exact time. I left my latchkey at home, and my servant had let me in. If you want any corroborative evidence on the subject, you can ask him.
My dear fellow, as if I cared. Let us go up to the drawing room. No sherry, thank you, Mr. Chapman. Something has happened to you, Dorian. Tell me what it is. You're not yourself tonight.
Don't mind me, Harry. I'm irritable and out of temper. I shall come round and see you tomorrow or next day. Make my excuses to Lady Narborough. I shan't go upstairs. I'll go home. I must go home.
All right, Dorian, I dare say I shall see you tomorrow at tea time. The Duchess is coming.
I'll try to be there, Harry, he said, leaving the room, and as he drove back to his own house, he was conscious that the sense of terror he thought he had strangled had come back to him. Lord Henry's casual questioning had made him lose his nerve for the moment, and he wanted his nerve still. Things that were dangerous had to be destroyed. He winced. He hated the idea of even touching them. And yet it had to be done. He realized that, and when he had locked the door of his library, he opened the secret press into which he had thrust Basil Hallward's coat and bag. A huge fire was blazing. He piled another log on it. The smell of the singeing clothes and burning leather was terrible. It took him 3/4 of an hour to consume everything, and at the end he felt faint and sick, and having lit some Algerian pastilles in a pierced copper brazier, he bathed his hands and forehead with a cool, musk-scented vinegar. And suddenly he started. His eyes grew strangely bright, and he gnawed nervously at his underlip. Between 2 of the windows stood a large Florentine cabinet made out of ebony and inlaid with ivory and blue lapis. He watched it as though it were a thing that could fascinate and make afraid, as though it held something that he longed for and yet almost loathed. His breath quickened, and a mad craving came over him. He lit a cigarette and then threw it away. His eyelids drooped till the long fringed lashes almost touched his cheek, but he still watched the cabinet. At last he got up from the sofa on which he had been lying, went over it, and having unlocked it, touched some hidden spring. A triangular drawer passed slowly out, and his fingers moved instinctively towards it, dipped in and closed on something. It was a small Chinese box of black and gold dust lacquer, elaborately wrought, the sides patterned with curved waves, and the silken cords hung round with crystals, and tasselled in plaited metal threads. He opened it, and inside was a green paste, waxy in lustre, the odour curiously heavy and persistent. He hesitated for some moments with a strangely immobile smile upon his face. Then, shivering, though the atmosphere of the room was terribly hot, he drew himself up and glanced at the clock. It was 20 minutes to 12. He put the box back, shutting the cabinet doors as he did so, and went into his bedroom. And as midnight was striking bronze blows upon the dusky air, Dorian Gray, dressed commonly, and with a muffler wrapped round his throat, crept quietly out of his house. In Bond Street he found a hansom with a good horse. He hailed it, and in a low voice gave the driver an address. The man shook his head. "It's too far for me."
"Here's a sovereign for you. Shall have another if you drive fast."
"All right, sir. You'll be there in an hour." And after his fare had got in, he turned his horse round and drove rapidly toward the river. Chapter 16. A cold rain began to fall, and the blurred street lamps looked ghastly in the dripping mist. The public houses were closing, and the dim men and women were clustering in broken groups round their doors. From some of the bars came the sound of horrible laughter, and in others drunkards brawled and screamed. Lying back in the hansom, with his hat pulled over his forehead, Dorian Gray watched with listless eyes the sordid shame of the great city, and now and then he repeated to himself the words that Lord Henry had said to him on the first day they'd met. To cure the soul... Apologies. To cure the soul by the means of the senses, and the senses by the means of the soul. Yes, that was the secret. He'd often tried it, and would try it again now. There were opium dens where one could buy oblivion, dens of horror where the memory of old sins could be destroyed by the madness of sins that were new. The moon hung low in the sky, like a yellow skull. From time to time a huge misshapen cloud stretched a long arm across and hid it. The gas lamps grew fewer, and the streets more narrow and gloomy. Once the man lost his way and had to drive back half a mile. Steam rose from the horse as it splashed up on the puddles. The side windows of the hansom were clogged with a grey flannel mist. To cure the soul by the means of the senses, and the senses by the means of the soul. How the words rang in his ears. His soul certainly was sick to death. Was it true that the senses would cure it? Innocent blood had been spilled. Who would atone for that? For that there was no atonement, but though forgiveness was impossible, forgetfulness was possible still, and he was determined to forget, to stamp the thing out, to crush it as one would crush the adder that had stung one. Indeed, what right had Basil to have spoken over him as he'd done? Who made him a judge over others? He had said things that were dreadful, horrible, not to be endured. On and on plodded the hansom, going slower it seemed to him at each step. He thrust up the trap and called to the man to drive faster. The hideous hunger for opium began to draw at him. His throat burned and his delicate hands twitched nervously together. He struck the horse madly with his stick, and the driver laughed and whipped up. He laughed in answer, and the man was silent. The way seemed interminable, and the streets like the black web of some sprawling spider. The monotony became unbearable, and as the mist thickened, he felt afraid. Then they passed by lonely brick-fields. The fog was lighter here, and he could see the strange bottle-shaped kilns with their orange, fan-like tongues of fire. A dog barked as they went by, and far away in the darkness some wandering seagull screamed. The horse stumbled in a rut and then swerved aside and broke into a gallop. After some time they left the clay road and rattled again over rough paven streets. Most of the windows were dark, but now and then fantastic shadows were silhouetted against some lamp-lit blind. He watched them curiously. They moved like monstrous marionettes and made gestures like live things. He hated them. A dull rage was in his heart. As they turned a corner, a woman yelled something at them from an open door, and 2 men ran after the hansom for about 100 yards. The driver beat at them with his whip. It's said that passion makes one think in a circle. Certainly with hideous iteration the bitten lips of Dorian Gray shaped and reshaped those subtle words that dealt with soul and sense, till he'd found in them the full expression, as it were, of his mood, and justified by intellectual approval, passions that without such justification would still have dominated his temper, from cell to cell of his brain, except the one thought, and the wild desire to live, most terrible of all man's appetites, quickened into force each trembling nerve and fibre. Ugliness that had once been hateful to him because it made things real became dear to him now for that very reason. Ugliness was the one reality. The coarse brawl, the loathsome den, the crude violence of the disordered life, the very vileness of thief and outcast were more vivid in their intense actuality of impression than all the gracious shapes of art, the dreamy shadows of song. They were what he needed for forgetfulness. In 3 days he would be free. Suddenly the man drew up with a jerk at the top of a dark lane. Over the low roofs and jagged chimney stacks of the houses rose the black masts of ships. Wreaths of white mist clung like ghostly sails to the yards. "Somewhere about here, sir, ain't it?" he asked huskily through the trap. Dorian started and peered round. "This will do," he answered, and got out hastily, and giving the driver the extra fare he'd promised him, walked quickly in the direction of the quay. Here and there a lantern gleamed at the stern of some huge merchantman. The light shook and splintered in the puddles. A red glare came from an outward-bound steamer that was coaling. The slimy pavement looked like a wet mackintosh. He hurried on toward the left, glancing back now and then to see if he was being followed. In about 7 or 8 minutes he reached a small, shabby house that was wedged in between two gaunt factories. In one of the top windows stood a lamp. He stopped and gave a peculiar knock. After a little time he heard steps in the passage and the chain being unhooked. The door opened quietly, and he went in without saying a word to the squat, misshapen figure that flattened itself into the shadow as he paused. At the end of the hall, hung a tattered green curtain that swayed and shook in the gusty wind which had followed him in from the street. He dragged it aside, and it entered a low, long room, which looked as if it had once been a third-rate dancing saloon. Shrill, flaring glass jets, dulled and distorted, and the fly-blown mirrors that faced them were ranged around the walls. Greasy reflectors of ribbed tin backed them, making quivering discs of light. The floor was covered with ochre-covered sawdust, trampled here and there in the mud, and stained with dark rings of spilled liquor. Some Malays were crouching by a little charcoal stove, playing with bone counters and showing their white teeth as they chattered. In one corner, with his head buried in his arms, a sailor sprawled over a table, and by the tawdrily painted bar that ran across one complete side stood 2 haggard women, mocking an old man who was brushing the sleeves of his coat with an expression of disgust. He thinks he's got red ants on him," laughed one of them as Dorian passed by. The man looked at her in terror and began to whimper. At the end of the room there was a little staircase leading to a darkened chamber. As Dorian hurried up its 3 rickety steps, the heavy odor of opium met his nostrils, and he heaved a deep breath, and he felt himself quiver with pleasure. When he entered, a young man with smooth yellow hair, who was bending over a lamp lighting a long, thin pipe, looked up at him and nodded in a hesitating manner. You hear, Adrian? Where else would I be? None of the chaps will speak to me now. I thought you'd left England. Darlington's not going to do anything. My brother paid the bill at last. George doesn't speak to me either. I don't care. As long as one has this stuff, one doesn't want friends. I think I've had too many friends. Dorian winced and looked round at the grotesque things that lay in such fantastic postures on the ragged mattresses. The twisted limbs, the gaping mouths, the staring, lustreless eyes that fascinated him. He knew in what strange heavens they were suffering, and what dull hells were teaching them the secret of some new joy. They were better off than he was. He was prisoned in thought. Memory, like a terrible malady, was eating his soul away. From time to time he seemed to see the eyes of Basil Hallward looking at him, and yet he felt he couldn't stay. The presence of Adrian Singleton troubled him. He wanted to be where no one would know who he was. He wanted to escape from himself. I'm going on to the other place. On the wharf? Yes. That mad cat is sure to be there. They won't have her in this place now. I'm sick of women who love one. Women who hate one are much more interesting. Besides, the stuff is better. Much the same. I like it better. Come and have something to drink. I must have something. I don't want anything. Never mind. Adrian Singleton rose up wearily and followed Dorian to the bar. A half-caste in a ragged turban and a shabby ulster grinned a hideous greeting as he thrust a bottle of brandy and 2 tumblers in front of them. The women sidled up and began to chatter, and Dorian turned his back on them and said something in a low voice to Singleton. A crooked smile like a crease writhed across the face of one of the women. We are very proud tonight. For God's sake, don't talk to me, cried Dorian, stamping his foot on the ground. What do you want? Money? Here it is. Don't ever talk to me again. 2 red sparks flashed for a moment in the woman's sodden eyes and then flickered out and left them dull and glazed. She tossed her head and raked the coins off the counter with greedy fingers. Her companion watched her enviously. It's no use. I don't care to go back. What does it matter? I'm quite happy here. You'll write to me if you want anything, won't you? Perhaps. Good night, then. Good night. answered the young man, passing up the steps and wiping his parched mouth with a handkerchief. Dorian walked to the door with a look of pain in his face, and as he drew the curtain aside, a hideous laugh broke from the painted lips of the woman who had taken his money. "There goes the devil's bargain."
"Curse you, don't call me that."
She snapped her fingers. "Prince Charming is what you like to be called, ain't it?" The drowsy sailor leapt to his feet as she spoke, and looked wildly round. The sound of the shutting of the hall door fell on his ear, and he rushed out as if in pursuit. Dorian hurried along the quay through the drizzling rain. His meeting with Adrian had strangely moved him, and he wondered if the ruin of that young life was really to be laid at his door at Basil Hallward, as said to him with such infamy of insult. He bit his lip, and for a second his eyes grew sad. Yet, after all, what did it matter to him? One's days were too brief to take the burden of another's errors on one's shoulders. Each man lived his own life, and paid his own price for living it. The only pity was one had to pay so often for a single fault. One had to pay over and over again indeed. In her dealings with man, destiny never closed her accounts. There are moments, psychologists tell us, when the passion for sin, or for what the world calls sin, so dominates a nature that every fiber of the body, as every cell of the brain, seems to be instinct with fearful impulses. Men and women at such moments lose the freedom of their will. They move to their terrible end as automatons move. Choice is taken from them, and conscience is either killed, or, if it lives at all, lives but to give rebellion its fascination and disobedience its charm. For all sins, as theologians weary not of reminding us, are sins of disobedience. When that high spirit, that morning star of evil, fell from heaven, it was as a rebel he fell. Callous, concentrated on evil, with stained mind and soul hungry for rebellion, Dorian hastened on, quickening his step as he went, but he darted aside into a dim archway that had served him often as a shortcut to the ill-famed place where he was going, and felt himself suddenly seized from behind, and before he had time to defend himself, was thrust back against the wall, a brutal hand round his throat. He struggled madly for life, and by a terrible effort wrenched the tightening fingers away. In a second he heard the click of a revolver, and saw the gleam of a polished barrel, pointing straight at his head, and the dusky form of a short, thick-set man facing him.
What do you want?"
Keep quiet. If you stir, I shoot you.
"You're mad. What have I done to you?"
You wrecked the life of Sybil Vane, and Sybil Vane was my sister. She killed herself, I know it. Her death is at your door. I swore I'd kill you in return. For years I've sought you. I had no clue, no trace. The two people who could have described you were dead. But I knew nothing of you, except the pet name she used to call you. I heard it tonight by chance. Make your peace with God. Tonight you're going to die.
Dorian grew sick with fear.
"I never knew her. I never heard of her. You're mad."
You had better confess your sin, for as sure as I'm James Vane, you're going to die.
There was a horrible moment, and Dorian didn't know what to say or do.
Down on your knees. I give you 1 minute to make your peace, no more. I go on board tonight for India, and I gotta do my job first. 1 minute, that's all.
Dorian's arms fell to his side. Paralyzed with terror, he didn't know what to do, and suddenly a wild hope flashed across his brain. "Stop! How long ago is it since your sister died? Quick, tell me."
18 years. Why do you ask me? What do years matter?
18 years,
laughed Dorian with a touch of triumph in his voice.
18 years. Set me under the lamp and look at my face.
James Vane hesitated for a moment, not understanding what was meant. Then he seized Dorian and dragged him from the archway. Dim and wavering was the wind-blown light, yet it served to show him the hideous error as it seemed into which he had fallen, for the face of the man he'd sought to kill all the bloom of boyhood, all the unstained purity of youth. He seemed little more than a lad of 20 summers, hardly older, if older indeed at all, than his sister had been when they had parted so many years ago. It was obvious that this was not the man who had destroyed her life.
My God!
He loosened his hold and reeled back.
My God, I would have murdered you.
Dorian drew in a long breath.
"You've been on the brink of committing a terrible crime, my man,"
he said, looking at him sternly.
"Let this be a warning to you to not take vengeance into your own hands.
Forgive me, sir. I was deceived. The choice word I heard in that den set me on the wrong track.
You'd better go home and put that pistol away, or you may get into trouble,
said Dorian, turning on his heel and going slowly down the street. James Vane stood on the pavement in horror. He was trembling from head to foot. After a little while, the black shadow that had been creeping along the dripping wall moved out into the light and came close to him with stealthy footsteps. He felt a hand laid on his arm and looked round with a start. It was one of the women who had been drinking at the bar. "Why didn't you kill him?" she hissed out, putting a haggard face quite close to his. "I knew you were following him when you rushed out from Daly's. You fool, you should have killed him. He has lots of money and he's bad as bad." "He's not the man I'm looking for, and I want no man's money. I want a man's life. The man whose life I want must be nearly 40 now. This one's a little more than a boy. Thank God I've not got his blood upon my hands." Little more than a boy? Why, it's nigh on 18 years since Prince Charming made me what I am." "You lie." She raised her hand up to heaven. "Before God, I'm telling the truth." "Before God?" "Strike me dumb if it ain't so. He's the worst one that comes here. They say he's sold himself to the devil for a pretty face. Nigh on 18 years since I met him, and he hasn't changed much since then. I have, though." "You swear it?" "I swear it," came in a hoarse echo from her flat mouth. "But don't give me away to him. I'm afraid of him. Let me have some money for my night's lodging." He broke from her with an oath, and rushed to the corner of the street, but Dorian had disappeared. When he looked back, the woman had vanished also. A week later, Dorian Gray was sitting in the conservatory at Selby Royal, talking to the pretty Duchess of Monmouth, who was with her husband, a jaded-looking man of 60, and was amongst his guests. It was tea-time, and the mellow light of the huge lace-covered lamp that stood on the table lit up the delicate china and hammered silver of the service at which the Duchess was presiding. Her white hands were moving daintily among the cups, and her full red lips were smiling at something Dorian had whispered to her. Lord Henry was lying back in a silk-draped wicker chair, looking at them. On a peach-coloured divan sat Lady Narborough, pretending to listen to the Duke's description of the last Brazilian beetle that he'd added to his collection. 3 young men in elaborate smoking suits were handing tea-cakes to some of the women. The house party consisted of 12 people, and there were more expected to arrive on the next day.
"What are you two talking about?"
said Lord Henry, strolling over to the table and putting his cup down.
"I hope Dorian has told you about my plan for rechristening everything, Gladys. It's a delightful idea."
"But I don't want to be rechristened, Harry," rejoined the Duchess, looking up at him with her wonderful eyes. "I'm quite satisfied with my own name, and I'm sure Mr. Gray should be satisfied with his."
My dear Gladys, I would not alter either name for the world. They're both perfect. I was thinking chiefly of flowers. Yesterday I caught an orchid from my buttonhole, and it was a marvellous spotted things, as effective as the 7 deadly sins. In a thoughtless moment, I asked one of the gardeners what it was called. He told me it was a fine specimen of Robinsoniana, or something dreadful of that kind. It's a sad truth, but we've lost the faculty of giving lovely names to things. Names are everything. I never quarrel with actions. My one quarrel's with words. That's the reason I hate vulgar realism in literature. The man who would call a spade should be compelled to use one. It's the only thing he's fit for.
"And what shall we call you, Harry?"
"His name is Prince Paradox," said Dorian.
"I recognize him in a flash."
"I won't hear of it,"
laughed Henry, sinking into the chair.
"From a label there is no escape. I refuse the title."
"Royalties may not abdicate."
"You wish me to defend my throne, then?"
"Yes."
"I give the truths of tomorrow."
"I prefer the mistakes of today."
"You disarm me, Gladys,"
he cried, catching the wilfulness of her mood. "Of your shield, Harry, not of your spear."
"I never tilt against beauty."
"That's your error, Harry, believe me. You value beauty far too much."
"How can you say that? I admit that I think it is better to be beautiful than to be good. But on the other hand, no one's more ready than I am to acknowledge that it's better to be good than to be ugly."
"Ugliness is one of the 7 deadly sins, then?" What becomes of your simile about the orchid?
Ugliness is one of the 7 deadly virtues, Gladys. You, as a good Tory, must not underrate them. Beard, the Bible, and the 7 deadly virtues have made our England what she is.
You don't like what your country's done, then?
I live in it.
That you may censure it the better.
Would you have me take the verdict of Europe on it?
What do they say of us?
That Huttoff has emigrated to England and opened shop.
Is that yours, Harry?
I give it to you.
I couldn't use it, it's too true.
You need not be afraid. Our countrymen never recognize a description.
They're practical.
They're more cunning than practical. When they make up their ledger, they balance stupidity by wealth and vice by hypocrisy.
Still, we've done great things.
Great things have been thrust on us, Gladys.
We've carried their burden.
Only as far as the stock exchange.
I believe in the race.
It represents the survival of the pushing.
It has development.
Decay fascinates me more.
What of art?
It's a malady.
Love.
An illusion.
Religion.
The fashionable substitute for belief.
You're a skeptic.
Never. Skepticism is the beginning of faith.
What are you?
To define is to limit.
Give me a clue.
Threads snap, you'd lose your way in the labyrinth.
You bewilder me. Let's talk of someone else.
Our host is a delightful topic. Years ago he was christened Prince Charming.
Oh, don't remind me of that.
Our host is rather horrid this
evening. I believe he thinks that Monmouth married me on purely scientific principles is the best specimen he could find of a modern butterfly.
Well, I hope he won't stick pins into you, Duchess.
Oh, my maid does that already, Mr. Grey, when she's annoyed with me.
Oh, and what does she get annoyed with you about, Duchess?
For the most trivial things, Mr. Grey, I assure you. Usually because I come in at 10 minutes to 9 and tell her I must be dressed by 8:30.
How unreasonable of her. You should give her warning.
I daren't, Miss Grey. Why, she invents hats for me. You remember the one I wore at Lady Hilston's garden party? You don't, but it's nice of you to pretend that you do. Well, she made it out of nothing. All good hats are made out of nothing.
Like all good reputations, Gladys, every effect that one produces gives one an enemy. To be popular, one must be of mediocrity.
Not with women. And women rule the world. I assure you we can't bear mediocrities. We women, as someone says, love with our ears, just as you men love with your eyes, if you ever love at all.
Seems to me we never do anything else, mumbled Dorian.
Ah, then you never really love Mr. Grey.
My dear Gladys, how can you say that? Romance lives by repetition, and repetition converts an appetite into an art. Besides, each time that one loves is the only time one has ever loved. Difference of object does not alter singleness of passion. It merely intensifies it. And we can have in life but one great experience at best, and the secret of life is to reproduce that experience as often as possible.
Even when one has been wounded by it, Harry?
Especially when one has been wounded by it.
The Duchess turned and looked at Dorian Gray with a curious expression in her eyes. What do you say to that, Mr. Grey? Dorian hesitated for a moment. Then he threw his head back and laughed. I always agree with Harry, Duchess. Even when he's wrong? Harry's never wrong, Duchess. And does his philosophy make you happy?
I've never searched for happiness. Who wants happiness? I've searched for pleasure.
And found it, Mr. Grey?
Often, too often.
I'm searching for peace, and if I don't go and dress, I shall have none this evening.
Let me get you some orchids, Duchess,
cried Dorian, starting to his feet and walking down the conservatory.
You're flirting disgracefully with him. You'd better take care. He's very fascinating.
If he were not, then there would be no battle.
Greek meets Greek, then.
I'm on the side of the Trojans. They fought for a woman. Wait. No, back up. This is gonna get confusing because it's Harry talking to Dorian. No, never mind. It is still the lady talking.
They were defeated.
There are worse things than capture.
You gallop with a loose rein.
Pace gives life.
I shall write it in my diary tonight.
What? What?
That a burnt child loves the fire.
I'm not even singed. My wings are untouched. You use them.
You use them for everything except flight.
Courage is passed from men to women. It's a new experience for us.
You've arrived?
Who?
Lady Narborough. She perfectly adores him.
You fill me with apprehension. The appeal to antiquity is fatal to us who are romanticists.
Romanticists, you have all the methods of science.
Men have educated us.
But not explained to you.
Describe us.
Sphinxes without secrets.
She looked at him, smiling. How long Mr. Gray is. Let us go and help him. I have not yet told him the color of my frock.
Ah, you must suit your frock to his flowers, Gladys.
That would be a premature surrender.
Romantic art begins with its climax.
I must keep an opportunity for retreat.
In the Parthian manner?
They found safety in the desert. I couldn't do that.
Women are not always allowed a choice,
he answered, but he'd hardly finished the sentence before from the far end of the conservatory came a stifled groan, followed by the dull sound of a heavy fall. Everybody started up, and the Duchess stood motionless in horror, and with fear in his eyes Lord Henry rushed through the flapping palms to find Dorian Gray lying face downwards on the tile in a death-like swoon. He was carried at once into the blue drawing-room and laid upon one of the sofas. After a short time he came to himself and looked round with a dazed expression. "What's happened? Oh, I remember. Am I safe here, Harry?"
My dear Dorian, you merely fainted. That was all. You must have overtired yourself. You'd better not come down to dinner. I'll take your place.
No, I'll come down. I'd rather come down. I mustn't be alone. He went to his room and dressed. There was a wild recklessness of gaiety in his manner as he sat at table, but now and then a thrill of terror ran through him when he remembered that, pressed against the window of the conservatory like a white handkerchief, he'd seen the face of James Vane watching him. Chapter 18. The next day he didn't leave the house, and indeed spent most of the time in his own room, sick with a wild terror of dying, and yet indifferent to life itself. The consciousness of being hunted, snared, tracked down had begun to dominate him. If the tapestry did but tremble in the wind, he shook. The dead leaves that were blown against the leaded panes seemed to him like his own wasted solutions and wild regrets. When he closed his eyes, he saw again the sailor's face peering through the mist-stained glass, and horror seemed once more to lay its hand upon his heart. But perhaps it had been only his fancy that had called vengeance out of the night and set the hideous shape of punishment before him. Actual life was chaos, but there was something terribly logical in the imagination. It was the imagination that set remorse to dog the feet of sin. It was the imagination that made each crime bear its misshapen brood. In the common world of fact, the wicked were not punished, nor the good rewarded. Success was given to the strong, failure thrust upon the weak. That was all. Besides, had any stranger been prowling around the house, he would have been seen by the servants or the keepers. Had any footmarks been found on the flower beds, the gardeners would have reported it. Yes, it had been merely fancy. Sybil Vane's brother had not come back to kill him. He'd sailed away in a ship to founder in some winter sea. From him, at any rate, he was safe. Why, the man didn't know who he was, couldn't know who he was. The mask of youth had saved him. And yet, if it had been merely an illusion, how terrible it was to think that conscience could raise such fearful phantoms, and give them visible form, and make them move before one. What sort of life could his be, if day and night shadows of his crime would appear at him from silent corners, to mock him from secret places, to whisper in his ear as he sat at the feast, to wake him with icy fingers as he lay asleep? As the thought crept through his brain, he grew pale with terror, and the air seemed to him to have become suddenly colder. Oh, in what a wild hour of madness he had killed his friend! How ghastly the mere memory of the scene! He saw it all again. Each hideous detail came back to him with added horror. Out of the black cave of time, terrible and swathed in scarlet, rose the image of his sin. When Lord Henry came in at 6 o'clock, he found him crying as one whose heart will break. It was until the third day until he ventured to go out. There was something in the clear, pine-scented air of that winter morning that seemed to bring him back his joyousness and ardor for life. But it was not merely the physical conditions of the environment that had caused the change. His own nature had revolted against the excess of anguish that sought to maim and mar the perfection of its calm. With subtle and finely wrought temperaments it's always so. Their strong passions must either bruise or bend. They either slay the man or themselves die. Shallow sorrows and shallow loves live on. The loves and sorrows that are great are destroyed by their own plenitude. Besides, he'd convinced himself that he'd been the victim of a terror-stricken imagination, and looked back now on his fears with something of pity and not a little of contempt. After breakfast, he walked with the Duchess for an hour in the garden, and then drove across the park to join the shooting party. The crisp frost lay like salt upon the grass, and the sky was an inverted cup of blue metal. A thin film of ice bordered the flat, reed-grown lake. At the corner of the pine wood he caught sight of Sir Geoffrey Clouston, the Duchess's brother, jerking 2 spent cartridges out of his gun. He jumped from the cart, and having told the groom to take the mare home, made his way towards his guest through the withered bracken and rough undergrowth. "Have you had any good sport, Geoffrey?"
"Not very good, Dorian. I think most of the birds have gone to the open. I dare say it'll be better after lunch when we get to new ground."
Dorian strolled along by his side. The keen aromatic air, the brown and red lights that glimmered in the wood, the hoarse cries of the beaters ringing out from time to time, and the sharp snaps of the guns that followed fascinated him and filled him with a sense of delightful freedom. He was dominated by the carelessness of happiness, the high indifference of joy. Suddenly, from a lumpy tussock of old grass, some 20 yards in front of them, with black-tipped ears erect and long hinder limbs throwing it forward, started a hare. It bolted for a thicket of alders, and Sir Geoffrey put his gun to his shoulder, but there was something in the animal's grace of movement that strangely charmed Dorian Gray, and he cried out at once, "Don't shoot it, Geoffrey, let it live."
What nonsense, Dorian.
Wait, what was the guy's voice?
Yeah. "What nonsense, Dorian,"
laughed his companion, and as the hare bounded into the thicket he fired. There were 2 cries heard, the cry of a hare in pain, which is dreadful, and the cry of a man in agony, which is worse.
"Good heavens, I've hit a beater! What an imbecile! The man was to get in front of the gun. Stop shooting there! Man's hurt!"
he cried out at the top of his voice, and the head-keeper came running up with a stick in his hand. "Where, sir? Where is he?" he shouted, and at the same time the firing ceased along the line.
"Here,"
answered Sir Geoffrey angrily, hurrying towards the thicket.
"Why on earth don't you keep your men back? Spoiled my shooting for the day."
Dorian watched them as they plunged into the alder clump, brushing the lithe swinging branches aside, and in a few moments they emerged, dragging a body after them into the sunlight. He turned away in horror, and it seemed to him that misfortune followed wherever he went. He heard Sir Geoffrey ask if the man was really dead, and the affirmative answer of the keeper. The wood seemed to him to have suddenly become alive with faces. There was the trampling of the myriad feet and the low buzz of voices. A great copper-breasted pheasant came beating through the boughs overhead, and after a few moments that were to him in his perturbed state like endless hours of pain, he felt a hand laid on his shoulder. He started and looked round.
"Dorian, I'd better tell them that shooting's stopped for today. It wouldn't look well to go on."
"I wish it was stopped forever, Harry. The whole thing's hideous and cruel. Is the man—" He couldn't finish his sentence.
"I'm afraid so. He got the whole charge of shot in his chest. He must have died almost instantaneously. Come, let us go home."
They walked side by side in the direction of the avenue for nearly 50 yards without speaking, and then Dorian looked at Lord Henry and said with a heavy sigh, It's a bad omen, Henry, Harry, a bad omen, a very bad one."
"What is? Oh, this accident, I suppose. My dear fellow, it can't be helped. It was the man's own fault. Why did he get in front of the guns? Besides, it's nothing to us. It's rather awkward for Geoffrey, of course. It does not do to pepper beaters. Makes people think that one is a wild shot, and Geoffrey's not. He shoots very straight. But there's no use talking about the matter."
Dorian shook his head. "It's a bad omen, Harry. I feel as if something horrible was going to happen to some of us. To myself, perhaps," he added, passing his hand over his eyes with a gesture of pain. The elder man laughed.
The only horrible thing in the world is to ennui. Dorian, that is the one sin for which there's no forgiveness, but we're not likely to suffer from it unless these fellows keep chattering about this thing at dinner. I must tell them that the subject is to be tabooed. As for omens, there's no such thing as an omen. Destiny does not send us heralds. She's too wise or too cruel for that. Besides, what on earth could happen to you, Dorian? You have everything in the world that a man could want. There's no one who would not be delighted to change places with you.
There's no one with whom I would not change places, Harry. Don't laugh like that. I'm telling you the truth. The wretched peasant who has just died is better off than I am. I have no terror of death. It's the coming of death that terrifies me. Its monstrous wings seem to wheel in the leaden air around me. Good heavens, don't you see a man moving the trees there, watching me, waiting for me? Lord Henry looked in the direction which the trembling gloved hand was pointed.
Yes, I see the gardener waiting for you. I suppose he wants to ask you what flowers you wish to have on the table tonight. How absurdly nervous you are, my dear fellow. You must come and see my doctor when we get back to town.
Dorian heaved a sigh of relief as he saw the gardener approaching. The man touched his hat, glanced for a moment at Lord Henry in a hesitating manner, and then produced a letter, which he handed to his master. Her Grace told me to wait for an answer. Dorian put the letter in his pocket. Tell her Grace that I'm coming in, he said coldly, and the man turned round and went rapidly in the direction of the house.
How fond women are of doing dangerous things. It's one of the qualities in them that I admire most. A woman will flirt with anybody in the world as long as other people are looking on.
How fond are you of saying dangerous things, Harry? In the present instance, you're quite astray. I like the Duchess very much, but I don't love her.
And the Duchess loves you very much, but she likes you less, so you're excellently matched.
You're talking scandal, Harry, and there's never any basis for scandal.
The basis of every scandal is an immoral certainty.
You'd sacrifice anybody, Harry, for the sake of an epigram.
The world goes to the altar of its own accord.
I wish I could love, but I seem to have lost the passion and forgotten the desire. My own personality has become a burden for me. I want to escape, to go away, to forget. It was silly of me to come down here at all. I think I shall send a wire to Harvey to have the yacht getting ready. On a yacht one is safe.
Safe from what, Dorian?
You're in some trouble. Why not tell me what it is?
You know I would help you.
I can't tell you, Harry. I dare say it's only a fancy of mine. This unfortunate accident has upset me. I have a horrible presentiment that something of the kind may happen to me.
What nonsense.
I hope it is, but I can't help feeling it. Ah, here's the Duchess, looking like Artemis in a tailor-made gown. You see we've come back, Duchess. I've heard all about it, Mr. Gray. Poor Geoffrey is terribly upset, and it seems that you asked him not to shoot the hare. How curious. Yes, it was very curious. I don't know what made me say it. Some whim, I suppose. It looked the loveliest of little live things. But I'm sorry they told you about the man. It's a hideous subject.
It's an annoying subject that has no psychological value at all. Now, if Geoffrey had done the thing on purpose, how interesting he would be. I should like to know someone who's committed a real murder.
How horrid of you, Harry. Isn't it Mr. Gray? Mr. Gray's ill again. He's going to faint. Dorian drew himself up with a bit of effort and smiled. It's nothing, Duchess. My nerves are dreadfully out of order. That's all. I'm afraid I walked too far this morning. I didn't hear what Harry said. Was it very bad? You must tell me some other time. I think I must go and lie down. You will excuse me, won't you? They had reached the great flight of steps that led from the conservatory onto the terrace. As the glass door closed behind Dorian, Lord Henry turned and looked at the Duchess with his slumberless eyes.
Are you very much in love with him?
She didn't answer for some time, but stood gazing at the landscape instead. I wish I knew.
Knowledge would be fatal. It's the uncertainty that charms one. A mist makes things wonderful.
One may lose one's way.
Always end at the same point, my dear Gladys.
What's that?
Disillusion.
It was my debut in life.
It came to you crowned.
I'm tired of strawberry leaves.
They become you.
Only in public.
You'd miss them.
I'll not part with a petal.
One with has ears.
Old age is dull of hearing.
Has he never been jealous?
I wish he had been. He glanced about as if in search of something. What are you looking for?
The button from your foil, you've dropped it.
I still have the mask.
It makes your eyes lovelier.
She laughed again, and her teeth showed like white seeds in a scarlet fruit. Upstairs in his own room, Dorian was lying on a sofa, with terror in every tingling fibre of his body. Life had suddenly become too hideous a burden for him to bear. The dreadful death of the unlucky beater, shot in the thicket like a wild animal, had seemed to him to prefigure death for himself also. He had nearly swooned at what Lord Henry had said in a chance mood of cynical jesting. At 5 o'clock he rang his bell for his servant, and gave him orders to pack his things for the night express to town, and to have the brougham at the door by 8:30. He was determined not to sleep another night at Selby Royal. It was an ill-omened place. Death walked there in the sunlight. The grass of the forest had been spotted with blood. Then he wrote a note to Lord Henry, telling him that he was going to town to consult his doctor, and asking him to entertain his guests in his absence. As he was putting it into the envelope, a knock came to the door, and his valet informed him that the head keeper wished to see him. He frowned and bit his lip. "Send him in," he muttered after some moments' hesitation. Soon as the man entered, Dorian pulled his checkbook out of a drawer and spread it out before him. "I suppose you've come about the unfortunate accident of the morning, Thornton?"
Yes, sir.
Was the poor fellow married? Had he any people dependent on him? If so, I should not like them to be left in want, and will send them any sum of money you may think necessary.
We don't know who he is, sir. That's what I took the liberty of coming to you about.
And don't know who he is? What do you mean? Wasn't he one of your men?
No, sir. Never seen him before. Seems like a sailor, sir.
The pen dropped from Dorian Gray's hand, and he felt as if his heart had suddenly stopped beating.
A sailor? Did you say a sailor?
Yes, sir. Looks as if he'd been some sort of sailor. He was tattooed on both arms, that kind of thing.
Was there anything found on him? Said Dorian, leaning forward and looking at the man with startled eyes. Anything that would tell his name?
Some money, sir. Not much, and a 6-shooter. There was no name of any kind. Decent-looking man, but a bit rough-like. Sort of sailor, like I said.
Dorian started to his feet, and a terrible hope fluttered past him. He clutched at it madly.
Where's the body?
Quick, I must see it at once.
It's in an empty stable in the home farm, sir. The folk don't like to have that sort of thing in their houses. Say corpse bring bad luck.
The home farm. Go there at once. Meet me. Tell one of the grooms to bring my horse around. No, never mind. I'll go to the stables myself. It'll save time. In less than a quarter of an hour, Dorian Gray was galloping down the long avenue as hard as he could go. The trees seemed to sweep past him in spectral procession, and wild shadows to fling themselves across his path. Once the mare swerved at a white gate-post and nearly threw him. He lashed her across the neck with his crop, and she cleft the dusky air like an arrow. The stones flew from her hooves. At last he reached the home farm. 2 men were loitering in the yard. He leapt from the saddle and threw the reins to one of them. In the farthest stable a light was glimmering. Something seemed to tell him that the body was there, and he hurried to the door and put his hand upon the latch. There he paused for a moment, feeling that he was on the brink of a discovery that would either make or mar his life. Then he thrust the door open and entered. On a heap of sacking in the far corner was lying the dead body of a man dressed in a coarse shirt and a pair of blue trousers. A spotted handkerchief had been placed over the face. A coarse candle, stuck in a bottle, spluttered beside it. Dorian Gray shuddered. He felt that his could not be the one hand to take the handkerchief away, and called out to one of the farm servants to come to him.
"Take that thing off the face. I wish to see it,"
he said, clutching at the door-post for support. When the farm servant had done so, he stepped forward. A cry of joy broke from his lips. The man who had been shot in the thicket was James Vane. He stood there for some minutes looking at the dead body, and as he rode home, his eyes were full of tears, for he knew he was safe. Chapter 19.
"There's no use your telling me that you're going to be good,"
cried Lord Henry, dipping his white fingers into a red copper bowl filled with rose water.
You're quite perfect. Pray don't change.
No, Harry, I've done too many dreadful things in my life. I'm not going to do any more. I began my good actions yesterday.
Where were you yesterday?
In the country, Harry. I was staying at a little inn by myself.
My dear boy, anybody can be good in the country. There's no temptations there. That's the reason why people who live out of town are so absolutely uncivilized. Civilization is not by any means an easy thing to attach to. And there are only two ways by which man can reach it. One is by being cultured, the other by being corrupt. Country people have no opportunity for being either, so they stagnate. Culture and corruption? I have known something of both. It seems terrible to me now that they should ever be found together. For I have a new ideal, Harry. I am going to alter. I think I have altered. You've not yet told me what your good action was, or did you say you'd done more than one?
Asked his companion as he spilled into his plate a little crimson pyramid of seeded strawberries, and threw a perforated shell-shaped spoon, snowed white sugar upon them. I can tell you, Harry, it's not a story I would tell to anyone else. I spared somebody. It sounds vain, but you understand what I mean. She was quite beautiful and wonderfully like Sybil Vane. I think it was that which first attracted me to her. You remember Sybil, don't you? How long ago that seems. Well, Hetty was not one of our own class, of course. She was simply a girl in a village, but I really loved her. I'm quite sure that I loved her. All during this wonderful May that we've been having, I used to run down and see her 2 or 3 times a week. Yesterday she met me in a little orchard. The apple blossoms kept tumbling down on her hair, and she was laughing. We were to have gone away together this morning at dawn. Suddenly I determined to leave her as flower-like as I'd found her.
I should think the novelty of the emotion must have given you a thrill of real pleasure, Dorian. But I can finish your idyll for you. That you gave her good advice and broke her heart. That was the beginning of your reformation.
Harry, you're horrible. You mustn't say these dreadful things. Hetty's heart's not broken. Of course she cried and all that, but there's no disgrace upon her. She can live, like Perdita, in her garden of mint and marigold.
And weep over a faithless Florizel,
said Henry, laughing as he leaned back in his chair.
My dear Dorian, you have the most curiously boyish moods. Do you think this girl will ever be really content now with anyone of her own rank? I suppose she'll be married some day to a rough carter or a green ploughman. Or the fact of having met you and loved you, well, it'll teach her to despise her husband, and she'll be wretched. From a moral point of view, I cannot say that I think much of your great renunciation. Even as a beginning, it's poor. Besides, how do you know that Hetty isn't floating at the present moment in some starlit mill-pond, with lovely water lilies round her like Ophelia? I can't bear this, Harry. You mock at everything and then suggest the most serious tragedies. I'm sorry I told you now. I don't care what you say to me. I know I was right in acting as I did. Poor Hetty. As I rode past the farm this morning, I saw her white face at the window like a spray of jasmine. Don't let us talk about it any more, and don't try to persuade me the first good action that I've done for years, the first little bit of self-sacrifice I've known, is really a sort of sin. I want to be better. I'm going to be better. Tell me something about yourself. What's going on in town? I've not been to the club for days. The people are still discussing poor Basil's disappearance.
I should have thought they've gotten tired of that by this time.
My dear boy, they've only been talking about it for 6 weeks, and the British public are really not equal to the mental strain of having more than one topic every 3 months. They've been very fortunate lately. They've had my own divorce case, and Alan Campbell's, well, unfortunate end. Now they've got the mysterious disappearance of an artist. Scotland Yard still insists that the man in the grey ulster who left for Paris by the midnight train on the 9th of November was poor Basil, and the French police declare that Basil never arrived in Paris at all. I suppose in about a fortnight we shall be told he has been seen in San Francisco. It's an odd thing, but everyone who disappears is said to be seen at San Francisco. Must be a delightful city, and possess all the attractions of the next world.
What do you think has happened to Basil? Asked Dorian, holding up his burgundy against the light and wondering how it was that he could discuss the matter so calmly.
I've not the slightest idea. If Basil chooses to hide himself, it's no business of mine. If he's dead, I don't want to think about him. Death is the only thing that ever terrifies me. I hate it.
Why?
Because,
said Lord Henry, passing beneath his nostrils the gilt trellis of an open vinaigrette box.
One can survive everything nowadays except that. Death and vulgarity are the only two facts in the 19th century that one cannot explain away. Let us have our coffee in the music room, Dorian. You must play Chopin to me. The man with whom my wife ran away played Chopin exquisitely. Poor Victoria, I was very fond of her. The house is rather lonely without her. Of course, married life is merely a bad habit. But then one regrets the loss of one even's worst habits. Perhaps one regrets them the most. They're such an essential part of one's personality. Dorian said nothing, but rose from the table, and passing into the next room, sat down to the piano and let his fingers stray across the white and black ivory of the keys. After the coffee had been brought in, he stopped, and looking over at Lord Henry, said, "Harry, did it ever occur to you that Basil could have been murdered?" Well, Basil was very popular, and he always wore a Waterbury watch. But why should he have been murdered? He wasn't clever enough to have enemies. Of course, he had a wonderful genius for painting, but a man can paint like Velasquez and still be dull as possible. Basil was really rather dull. He only interested me once, and that was when he told me years ago that he had a wild adoration for you, that you were the dominant motive of his art.
Also, if I may speculate, Basil, super duper gay. Super duper gay for Dorian. I was very fond of Basil. But don't people say that he was murdered?
Oh, some of the papers do. It doesn't seem to me to be at all probable. I know there are dreadful places in Paris, but Basil was not the sort of man to go to them. He had no curiosity. It was his chief defect.
What would you say, Harry, if I told you that I had murdered Basil? Said the younger man, and he watched him intently after he'd spoken.
I would say, my dear fellow, that you are posing for a character that doesn't suit you. All crime is vulgar, just as all vulgarity is crime. It's not in you, Dorian, to commit a murder. I'm sorry if I hurt your vanity by saying so, but I assure you it's true. Crime belongs exclusively to the lower orders. I don't blame them in the smallest degree. I should fancy that crime was to them what art is to us, simply a method of procuring extraordinary sensations. A method of procuring extraordinary sensations? Do you think, then, that a man who once committed a murder could possibly do the same crime again? Don't tell me that. Oh, anything becomes a pleasure if one does it too often. That's one of the most important secrets of life, I should fancy. However, that murder's always a mistake. One should never do anything that one cannot talk about after dinner. But what that has passed from poor Basil, I wish I could believe that he'd come to such a really romantic end as you suggest, but I can't. I dare say he fell into the sign off an omnibus. The conductor hushed up the scandal. Yes, I should fancy that was his end. I see him lying now on his back under those dull green waters, with the heavy barges floating over him and long weeds catching in his hair. Do you know, I don't think he would have done much more good work. During the last 10 years his painting had gone off very much. Dorian heaved a sigh, and Lord Henry strolled across the room, began to stroke the head of a curious Java parrot, a large grey-plumaged bird with a pink crest and tail that was balancing itself upon a bamboo perch. As his pointed fingers touched it, it dropped the white scurf of crinkled lids over black glass-like eyes, began to sway backwards and forwards. Yes, he continued, turning round and taking his handkerchief out of his pocket. His painting had quite gone off. It seemed to me to have lost something. It had lost an ideal. When you and he ceased to be great friends, he ceased to be a great artist. What was it that separated you? I suppose he bored you. If so, he never forgave you. It's a habit boors have. By the way, what has become of your wonderful portrait he did of you? I don't think I've ever seen it since he finished it. Oh, I remember your telling me years ago that you had it sent down to Selby, and it got mislaid or stolen on the way. You never got it back. What a pity. It was really a masterpiece. I remember I wanted to buy it. Wish I had now. It belonged to Basil's best period. Since then his work was that curious mixture of bad painting and good intentions that always entitles a man to be called a representative British artist. Did you advertise for it? You should.
I forget. I suppose I did, but I never really liked it. I'm sorry I sat for it. The memory of the thing is hateful to me. Why do you talk of it? It used to remind me of those curious lines in some play. Hamlet, I think? How do they run? Like the painting of a sorrow, a face without a heart? Yes, that's what it's like.
Lord Henry laughed.
If a man treats life artistically, his brain is his heart,
he answered, sinking into an armchair. Dorian shook his head and struck some soft chords on the piano. Like the painting of sorrow, a face without a heart. The elder man lay back and looked at him with half-closed eyes.
By the way, Dorian, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and lose, how did that quotation run, his own soul?
The music jarred, and Dorian started and stared at his friend. Why do you ask me that, Harry?
My dear fellow, I ask you because I thought you might be able to give me an answer.
He quirked his eyebrows in surprise.
That's all. I was going through the park last Sunday, and close by the Marble Arch there stood a little crowd of shabby-looking people, listening to some vulgar street preacher. As I passed by, I heard the man yelling out that question to his audience. It struck me as being rather dramatic. London's very rich in curious effects of that kind. A wet Sunday, an uncouth Christian in a mackintosh, a ring of sickly white faces under a broken roof of dripping umbrellas, and a wonderful phrase flung into the air by shrill, hysterical lips. It was really very good in its way, quite a suggestion. I thought of telling the prophet that art had a soul, but that man had not. I'm afraid, however, he wouldn't have understood me.
Don't, Harry. The soul is a terrible reality. It can be bought and sold and bartered away. It can be poisoned or made perfect. There's a soul in each one of us. I know it.
You are quite sure of that, Dorian?
Quite sure.
It must be an illusion, then. The things one feels absolutely certain about are never true. That's the fatality of faith and the lesson of romance. How grave you are. Don't be so serious. What have you or I to do with superstitions of your age and our age? No, we've given up our belief in the soul. Play me something. Play me a nocturne, Dorian. As you play, tell me, in a low voice, how you've kept your youth. You must have some secret. I'm only 10 years older than you are. I'm wrinkled, worn, yellow. You really are wonderful, Dorian. You've never looked more charming than you do tonight. You remind me of the day I saw you first. You were rather cheeky, very shy, and absolutely extraordinary. You've changed, of course, but not in appearance. I do wish you would tell me your secret to get back my youth. I'd do anything in the world, except take exercise, get up earlier, be respectable. Youth, there's nothing like it. It's an absurdity to talk of the ignorance of youth. The only people whose opinions I listen now with any respect are people much younger than myself. They seem in front of me. Life has revealed to them their latest wonder. As for the aged, I always contradict the aged. I do it on principle. If you ask them their opinion on something that happened yesterday, they solemnly give you the opinions current in 1820, when people wore high stocks, believed in everything, and knew absolutely nothing. How lovely that thing you're playing is. I wonder, did Chopin write it at Majorca, with the sea weeping round the villa and the salt spray dashing against the panes? It's marvellously romantic. What a blessing it is that there's one art left to us that's not imitative. Don't stop, I want music tonight. Seems to me that you're the young Apollo, and I'm the Nereus listening to you. I've sorrows, Dorian, of my own that you even know nothing of. The tragedy of old age is not that one is old, but that one is young. I'm amazed sometimes at my own sincerity. Oh, Dorian, how happy you are. What an exquisite life you've had. You've drunk deeply of everything. You've crushed the grapes against your palate. Nothing's been hidden from you, and it's all been to you no more than the sound of music. It's not marred you. You're still the same.
I'm not the same, Harry.
Yes, you are the same. I wonder what the rest of your life will be. Don't spoil it by renunciations. At present you're a perfect type. Don't make yourself incomplete. You're quite flawless now. You needn't shake your head. You know you are. Besides, Dorian, don't deceive yourself. Life is not governed by will or intention. Life is a question of nerves and fibers and slowly built-up cells in which thought hides itself and passion as it dreams. You may fancy yourself safe and think yourself strong, but a chance tone of color in a room or a morning sky, a particular perfume that you'd once loved, that brings subtle memories with it, a line from a forgotten poem that you'd come across again, a cadence from a piece of music that you'd cease to play. I tell you, Dorian, that's on things like these that our lives depend. Browning writes about them somewhere, but our own senses will imagine them for us. There are moments when the odor of Lilas Blanc passes suddenly across me, and I have the strangest month of my life over again. I wish I could change places with you, Dorian. The world's cried out against us both, but it's always worshipped you. It always will worship you. You're the type of what the age is searching for, and what it's afraid it has found. I'm so glad that you've never done anything, never carved a statue or painted a picture or produced anything outside of yourself. Life has been your art. You've set yourself to music. Your days are your sonnets.
Dorian rose up from the piano and passed his hand through his hair. Yes, life has been exquisite, but I'm not going to have the same life, Harry, and you mustn't say these extravagant things to me. You don't know everything about me. I think that if you did, even you would turn from me. Don't laugh. I know you're going to laugh.
Why have you stopped playing, Dorian? Go back and give me the nocturne over again. Look at that great honey-colored moon that hangs in the dusky air. She's waiting for you to charm her. And if you play, she'll come closer to the earth. You won't. Let us go to the club, then. It's been a charming evening, and we must end it charmingly. There's someone at White's who wants immensely to know you. Young Lord Poole, Bournemouth's eldest son. He's already copied your neckties, and he's begged me to introduce him to you. He's quite delightful. Rather reminds me of you.
I hope not. I'm tired tonight, Harry. I shan't go to the club. It's nearly 11, and I want to go to bed early.
Do stay. You've never played so well as tonight. There was something in your touch that was wonderful. Had more expression than I'd ever heard from it before.
It's because I'm going to be good. I'm a little changed already.
You cannot change me, Dorian. You and I will always be friends.
And yet you poisoned me with a book once. I shouldn't forgive that. Harry, promise me that you'll never lend that book to anyone. It does harm.
My dear boy, you're really beginning to moralize. You'll soon be going about like the converted and the revivalist, warning people against all the sins of which you've grown tired. You're much too delightful to do that. Besides, it's no use. You and I are what we are, and what we will be. As for being poisoned by a book, there's no such thing. Art has no influence upon action. It annihilates the desire to act. It's superbly sterile. The books that the world calls immoral are books that show the world from its own shame. That's all, but we won't discuss literature. Come round tomorrow. I'm going to ride at 11. We might go together, and I'd take you to lunch afterwards with Lady Branksome. She's a charming woman, wants to consult you about some tapestries she's thinking of buying. Mind you come. Or shall we lunch with our little Duchess? She says she never sees you now. Perhaps you're tired of Gladys. I thought you would be. Her clever tongue gets on one's nerves. In any case, be here at 11.
Must I really come, Harry?
Certainly. The park is quite lovely now. I don't think there have been such lilacs since the year I met you.
Very well. I shall be here at 11. Good night, Harry. As he reached the door, he hesitated for a moment, as if he had something to say, and then he sighed and went out. Chapter 20. It was a lovely night, so warm that he threw his coat over his arm and didn't even put his silk scarf round his throat. As he strolled home, smoking his cigarette, 2 young men in evening dress passed him, and he heard one of them whisper to the other, "That's Dorian Gray." He remembered how pleased he used to be when he was pointed out, or stared at, or talked about. He was tired of hearing his own name now. Half the charm of the little village where he had been so often lately was that no one knew who he was. He had often told the girl whom he had lured to love him that he was poor, and she had believed him. He had told her once that he was wicked, and she had laughed at him and answered that wicked people were always very old and very ugly. What a laugh she had, just like a thrush singing. And how pretty she had been in her cotton dresses and her large hats. She knew nothing, but she had everything that he had lost. When he reached home, he found a servant waiting up for him. He sent him to bed and threw himself down on the sofa in the library and began to think over some of the things that Lord Henry had said to him. Was it really true that no one could ever change? He felt a wild longing for the unstained purity of his boyhood, his rose-white boyhood, as Lord Henry had once called it. He knew that he'd tarnished himself, filled his mind with corruption, and given horror to his fancy. That he'd been an evil influence to others, and had experienced a terrible joy in being so, and that of the lives that had crossed his own it had been the fairest and most full of promise that he'd brought to shame. But was it all irretrievable? Was there no hope for him? In what a monstrous moment of pride and passion he had prayed that the portrait should bear the burden of his days, and he keep the unsullied splendor of eternal youth. All his failure had been due to that. Better for him that each sin of his life had brought its sure, swift penalty along with it. There was no purification in its punishment. Not forgive us our sins, but smite us for our iniquities, should be the prayer of a man most just to a most just God. The curiously carved mirror that Lord Henry had given to him so many years ago now was standing on the table, and the white-limbed cupids laughed round it as old. He took it up as he'd done on that night of horror when he first noted the change in the fatal picture, and with wild, tear-dimmed eyes looked into its polished shield. Once someone who terribly loved him had written to him a mad letter, ending with these idolatrous words: "The world is changed because you are made of ivory and gold. The curves of your lips rewrite history." The phrases came back to his memory, and he repeated them over and over to himself. Then he loathed his own beauty, and flinging the mirror on the floor, crushed it into silver splinters beneath his heel. It was his beauty that had ruined him, his beauty in the youth that might have been free from stain, that he'd pray for. For those two things, they'd ruined his life. His beauty had been to him but a mask, his youth but a mockery. What was youth at best? A green and unripe time, a time of shallow moods and sickly thoughts. Why had he worn its livery? Youth had spoiled him. It was better not to think of the past. Nothing could alter that. It was of himself and of his own future that he had to think. James Vane was hidden in a nameless grave in Selby churchyard. Alan Campbell had shot himself one night in his lab, but had not revealed the secret that he'd been forced to know. The excitement, such as it was over Basil Hallward's disappearance, would soon pass away. It was already waning. He was perfectly safe there. Nor, indeed, was it the death of Basil Hallward that weighed most upon his own mind. It was the living death of his own soul that troubled him. Basil had painted the portrait that marred his life. He couldn't forgive him that. It was the portrait that had done everything. Basil had said things to him that were unbearable, yet that he'd borne it with patience. The murder had been simply the madness of a moment. As for Alan Campbell, his actions had been his own. He'd chosen to do them. It was nothing to him. A new life. That was what he wanted. That was what he was waiting for. Surely he'd begun it already. He'd spared one innocent thing at any rate. He'd never again tempt innocence. He'd be good. As he thought of Hetty Merton, he began to wonder if the portrait in the locked room had changed. Surely it was not still so horrible as it had been. Perhaps if his life became pure, he'd be able to expel every sign of evil passion from the face. Perhaps the signs of evil had already gone away. He would go and look. He took the lamp from the table and crept upstairs. As he unbarred the door, a smile of joy flitted across his strangely young-looking face and lingered for a moment about his lips. Yes, he would be good, and the hideous thing that he'd hidden away would no longer be a terror to him. He felt as if the load had been lifted from him already. He went in quietly, locking the door behind him as was his custom, and dragged the purple hanging from the portrait. A cry of pain and indignation broke from him. He could see no change, save that in the eyes there was a look of cunning, and in the mouth there was the curved wrinkle of a hypocrite. The thing was still loathsome, more loathsome if possible than before, and the scarlet dew that spotted the hand seemed brighter and more like blood newly spilled. Then he trembled. Had it been merely vanity that made him do his one good deed, or the desire for a new sensation, as Lord Henry had hinted with his mocking laugh, or that passion to act a part that sometimes makes us do things finer than we are ourselves? Or perhaps all these. Why was the red stain larger than it had been? It seemed to have crept like a terrible disease over the wrinkled fingers. There was blood on the painted feet as though the thing had dripped, blood even on the hand that had not held the knife. Confess? Did it mean that he was to confess, to give himself up and be put to death? He laughed. He felt the idea was monstrous. Besides, even if he did confess, who would believe him? There was no trace of the murdered man anywhere. Everything belonging to him had been destroyed. He himself had burned what had been below stairs. The world would simply say that he's mad. They'd shut him up if he persisted in his story. Yet it was his duty to confess, to suffer public shame, and to make public atonement. It was God who called upon men to tell their sins to earth as well as to heaven.
Nothing that he could do would cleanse him till he told his own sin. His sin? He shrugged his shoulders. The death of Basil Hallward seemed very little to him. He was thinking of Hetty Merton, for it was an unjust mirror, this mirror of his soul that he was looking at. Vanity, curiosity, hypocrisy. Had there been nothing more in his renunciation than that? There had been something more, at least he thought so, but who could tell? No, there had been nothing more. Through vanity he had spared her. In hypocrisy he had worn the mask of goodness. For curiosity's sake he tried the denial of self. He recognized that now. But this murder, was it to dog him all his life? Was he always to be burdened by his past? Was he really to confess? Never. There was only one bit of evidence left against him, the picture itself. That was evidence. He would destroy it. Why had he kept it so long? Once it had given him pleasure to watch it changing and growing old. Of late he had felt no such pleasure. It kept him awake at night. When he had been away, he had been filled with terror lest other eyes should look upon it. It brought melancholy across his passions. Its mere memory had marred many moments of joy. It had been like conscience to him. Yes, it had been conscience. He would destroy it. He looked round and saw the knife that had stabbed Basil Hallward. He had cleaned it many times until there was no stain left upon it. It was bright and it glistened. As it had killed the painter, so it would kill the painter's work, and all that meant. It would kill the past, and when that was dead, he would be free. It would kill this monstrous soul life, and without its hideous warnings, he would be at peace. He seized the thing and stabbed the picture with it. There was a cry heard, and a crash. The cry was so terrible in its agony that the frightened servants woke and crept out of their rooms. 2 gentlemen who were passing in the square below stopped and looked up at the great house. They walked on till they met a policeman and brought him back. The man rang the bell several times, but there was no answer. Except for a light in one of the top windows, the house was all dark. After a time he went away and stood in an adjoining portico and watched. "Whose house is that, Constable?" "Mr. Dorian Gray's, sir." They looked at each other as they walked away and sneered. One of them was Sir Henry Ashton's uncle. Inside, in the servants' part of the house, the half-clad domestics were talking in low whispers to each other. Old Miss Leaf was crying and wringing her hands, and Francis was as pale as death. After about a quarter of an hour, he got the coachman and one of the footmen and crept upstairs. They knocked, but there was no reply, and they called out. Everything was still. Finally, after vainly trying to force the door, they got on the roof and dropped down onto the balcony. The windows yielded easily. Their bolts were old. When they entered, they found hanging upon the wall a splendid portrait of their master, as they had last seen him, in all the wonder of his exquisite youth and beauty. Lying on the floor was a dead man in evening dress, with a knife in his heart. He was withered, wrinkled, and loathsome of visage. It was not till they had examined the rings that they recognized who it was. All right, that was The Picture of Dorian Gray, and there's a reason it's an English class staple. It gets a little overbearing from time to time, but what English class book doesn't? Let's be honest. Definitely, really, at the time when this came out, I can see why there was such outcry over it. There's a lot of ideas in here that are still very repulsive, and there's definitely just that concept is very scary. If you're feeling very interactive, feel free to comment and say what you'd do with being infinitely prolonged like that. I know personally I would I would really just devote myself to the pursuit of knowledge. I like to know things, and I feel like I'd spend essentially just as much time as I possibly feasibly could just learning things. And that can be a negative thing, I could eschew the company of my fellow humans in order to just continue to learn things. Heck, if I was, infinitely prolonged, I could go on a quest to consume every piece of media known. That would be a long journey. It'd be interesting, though. But I digress. This has been Paper Cuts, and I hope it didn't sting.